At the dawn of the 1800s, London was already a city of immense scale and contradiction. It was the political heart of Britain, a growing commercial center, and the nerve center of an expanding empire. Yet it remained, in many ways, an unfinished city, shaped by centuries of gradual growth rather than grand design. The River Thames dominated London's geography and economy. It carried goods, people, and waste through the city, binding together docks, markets, and neighborhoods. Along its banks stood warehouses, shipyards, and crowded riverside communities whose livelihoods depended on trade moving in and out of the capital. London's streets were narrow, irregular, and often chaotic. Medieval road patterns still defined large parts of the city. Horse-drawn carts, pedestrians, street vendors, and livestock competed for space. There was no unified city government, no single authority overseeing sanitation, housing, or transport. Instead, London functioned as a patchwork of parishes, private interests, and local customs.
The population at the turn of the century stood at just over 1 million, already larger than any other city in Europe. This concentration of people created opportunity and pressure at the same time. Work was plentiful, but housing was cramped. Wealth accumulated rapidly in some districts, while others struggled with poverty, disease, and overcrowding. London in 1800 was not yet the Victorian metropolis it would become. Gaslighting was rare, railways did not exist, and much of the city still relied on systems that had changed little for generations. But beneath the surface, powerful forces were beginning to reshape the capital forces that would transform London more dramatically over the next 100 years than at any other time in its history. These pressures were already building, quietly and unevenly, across the city. As the 19th century progressed, London began to feel the strain of its own success. Population growth accelerated year by year, driven by migration from the countryside and smaller towns. Agricultural change and rural poverty pushed people toward the capital, while London's expanding economy pulled them in. By the 1830s and 1840s, entire communities were arriving faster than the city could absorb them.
Housing became one of the most immediate pressures. Older buildings were subdivided repeatedly to accommodate more residents. Single rooms housed entire families, and basements and attics were pressed into use, regardless of safety or health. New housing appeared quickly, often built cheaply and without regulation. Streets filled in, open spaces disappeared, and density increased far beyond what earlier generations had experienced. Sanitation lagged far behind population growth. Waste disposal relied largely on cesspits, open drains, and the Thames itself. As more people crowded into the city, these systems failed under the load. Contaminated water became common, and outbreaks of disease followed predictable patterns. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis spread rapidly through the poorest districts, exposing the link between environment, health, and inequality. Economic pressure reshaped daily life as well. London's economy was no longer based solely on craft and trade. Large-scale manufacturing, dockwork, construction, and service labor expanded dramatically. Employment was often insecure, wages fluctuated, and long working hours were common. For many, survival depended on a fragile balance between income, rent, and food prices. Social tension grew alongside these changes. Wealth and poverty existed in close proximity, separated sometimes by only a few streets. The visibility of hardship became harder to ignore. Reformers, journalists, and officials began to document living conditions, not out of sentiment, but because the scale of the problem threatened order, productivity, and public health. By mid-century, it was clear that London could not continue to grow without consequence. The pressures building within the city demanded new systems, new forms of control, and new ways of thinking about urban life. Change was no longer optional. It was becoming unavoidable. The first responses to London's growing pressures emerged gradually, often in reaction to crisis rather than long-term planning. Disease outbreaks, overcrowding, and visible poverty forced authorities and reformers to confront problems that had previously been managed at a local or informal level. These early shifts did not solve London's challenges, but they marked the beginning of a new approach to governing the city. Public health became a central concern. Investigations into cholera outbreaks revealed the relationship between contaminated water and disease. These findings challenged long-standing assumptions and led to the first serious efforts to regulate sanitation. Drainage systems were improved in some districts, cesspits were restricted, and clean water supplies began to expand, though unevenly and often slowly. Policing also changed. The creation of the Metropolitan Police in 1829 introduced a professional, uniformed force responsible for maintaining order across much of the city. This represented a shift away from older systems of local watchmen and parish-based enforcement. The new force aimed to manage crime and public disorder in a city that was becoming larger and more complex each year. Transportation began to adapt as well. Road improvements, new bridges across the Thames, and expanded coach services made movement through the city more efficient. These changes supported commercial growth and allowed London to spread outward. Commuting, though limited, became more common as people began living farther from their places of work. Culturally, London was becoming more self-aware. Newspapers expanded their reach, literacy rates rose, and public debate intensified. Reports on working conditions, housing, and health circulated widely, shaping public opinion and influencing policy. The city's problems were no longer hidden within individual neighborhoods. They were discussed as collective challenges affecting the nation's capital. These early shifts did not transform London overnight. Conditions remained harsh for many, and progress was uneven, but they signaled a turning point. The city was beginning to recognize itself as a system, one that required coordination, oversight, and long-term planning to function at the scale it had reached. By the middle of the 19th century, London's growth could no longer be managed through piecemeal reform. The city's size, density, and economic importance demanded large-scale systems capable of operating across districts and social boundaries. This period marked the transition from a loosely organized urban space to a city, increasingly shaped by central planning and institutional control. One of the most significant developments was the construction of a comprehensive sewer network, designed to address chronic pollution and repeated health crises. This system redirected waste away from streets and water supplies. It represented a fundamental shift in how the city understood public responsibility. Sanitation was no longer a private or local matter, but a collective necessity essential to urban survival. Water supply systems expanded alongside sanitation. Private companies and municipal authorities invested in reservoirs, pumping stations, and distribution networks. Access to cleaner water improved living conditions and reduced disease, though disparities remained between wealthier and poorer areas. Infrastructure increasingly determined health outcomes. Transportation underwent a similar transformation. Railways reached into the city, connecting London to the rest of Britain and reshaping its internal geography. Termini were built at the city's edges, concentrating traffic, labor, and commerce in new ways. Wheaton, London Underground railways began to appear, offering a solution to congestion at street level and allowing the city to grow outward even further. Administrative structures evolved to match this complexity. New governing bodies were established to coordinate works across boroughs and parishes. Regulations emerged governing building standards, street layout, and public services. The city became less organic and more engineered, driven by data, planning, and professional expertise. These systems brought efficiency and stability, but they also reinforced hierarchies. Decisions were made by engineers, officials, and policymakers, often far removed from the communities most affected. London became safer and more functional, yet also more controlled. The city was no longer simply expanding, it was being managed. By the late 19th century, London had reached a scale unprecedented in human history. Its population had grown from just over 1 million at the start of the century to well beyond 6 million by its end. This expansion reshaped not only the city itself, but the way urban life was understood across the world. The physical footprint of London spread rapidly. Railways and improved roads allowed developments to move outward, transforming surrounding villages into suburbs. Housing estates appeared along new transport lines, enabling separation between home and workplace on a mass scale. The idea of daily commuting became a defining feature of London life. Economic activity expanded in step with this growth. The docks along the Thames handled vast quantities of goods from across the empire. Finance, insurance, shipping, and administration concentrated in the city, reinforcing London's role as a global hub. Employment was increasingly specialized, with large numbers working in clerical, transport, and service roles that had scarcely existed in earlier generations. The numbers revealed stark contrasts. In some districts, living standards improved markedly. Public parks, libraries, museums, and civic buildings became part of everyday life. In others, overcrowding persisted despite reform efforts. Slum clearance often displaced residents rather than solving underlying shortages, pushing hardship into new areas. Institutions adapted to manage this scale. Schools expanded under compulsory education laws. Hospitals grew larger and more professionalist. Policing, firefighting, and public administration became permanent features of city life, rather than temporary responses to crises. London was no longer just a city of people and buildings. It had become a system of flows of labor, capital, goods, and information operating continuously. The sheer number of lives moving through this system each day created both opportunity and vulnerability. Stability depended on coordination. Disruption carried consequences on a scale never previously experienced. Behind London's expanding systems and growing numbers were millions of individual lives, shaped by the city's transformation. For some, the 19th century brought improved security, education, and opportunity. For others, it meant persistent hardship within an environment that was increasingly regulated but not always compassionate. Work dominated daily existence. Long hours were common across most occupations, from dock labor and factory work to domestic service and clerical employment. Job security varied widely. Injury, illness, or economic downturn could quickly push families into poverty. The absence of comprehensive welfare meant survival often depended on informal support networks or charitable institutions. Living conditions reflected class divisions with remarkable clarity. In wealthier districts, spacious housing, cleaner streets, and access to cultural institutions defined daily life. In poorer neighborhoods, overcrowding remained a constant challenge. Shared rooms, limited ventilation, and inadequate facilities shaped physical and mental health. Even as reforms improved infrastructure, their benefits reached different communities at different speeds. Family life adapted to urban pressures. Women and children contributed significantly to household incomes, whether through paid employment, home-based work, or service roles. Education gradually became more accessible, altering expectations for younger generations, though economic necessity often limited its reach. The city also imposed psychological demands. Noise, congestion, and constant movement became normal features of life. Anonymity increased as neighborhoods grew denser and more transient. Traditional community ties weakened in some areas, replaced by institutions and formal structures that managed daily needs. These human consequences were not uniform. They varied by location, occupation, and circumstance, but together, they formed a lived experience of 19th century London. A city that offered possibility alongside constraint and progress alongside enduring inequality. As the century advanced, Londoners adapted to the realities of living in a vast and highly structured city. These adaptations were not only imposed from above through policy and infrastructure, but also developed from within communities responding to everyday pressures. Voluntary organizations, charities, and religious institutions expanded their reach. They provided food, shelter, education, and medical care where state provision remained limited. While these efforts could not eliminate poverty, they formed a parallel system of support that helped stabilize daily life for many of the city's most vulnerable residents. Political responses also evolved. Reform movements gained influence, advocating for labor protections, housing regulation, and expanded public services. Gradually, limits were placed on working hours. Conditions improved in some industries, and basic standards were introduced for new housing. These changes reflected a growing acceptance that unregulated urban growth carried long-term risks. Cultural adaptation was equally significant. Entertainment and leisure became structured parts of city life. Music halls, theaters, public exhibitions, and organized sports offered relief from work and routine. Public parks provided controlled spaces for recreation, reflecting new ideas about health, order, and social behavior. Technological change reshaped habits and expectations. Gaslighting extended productive hours and altered perceptions of safety. Later in the century, Electric lighting and improved communications accelerated the pace of life. Time became more regulated, coordinated by timetables, clocks, and institutional schedules. Through these responses, London developed mechanisms to absorb its own complexity. The city did not eliminate inequality or hardship, but it learned how to function at scale. Adaptation became continuous rather than temporary, shaping a form of urban life that would influence cities far beyond Britain. By the end of the 19th century, London had become a model and a warning for modern urban development. The systems built to manage its size and complexity established patterns that would be adopted, adapted, and sometimes contested in cities across the world. Infrastructure remained one of the city's most enduring legacies. Sewer networks, underground railways, regulated streets, and coordinated public services did more than solve immediate problems. They redefined expectations of what a capital city was responsible for providing. Public health, transportation, and urban planning became permanent areas of governance rather than temporary responses to crises. Social structures also shifted in lasting ways. Class divisions hardened spatially, with clearer separation between residential, commercial, and industrial zones. Suburban expansion changed family life, commuting habits, and social interaction. The city's growth reinforced both opportunity and inequality. Embedding these contrasts into its physical layout, London's administrative evolution influenced political thinking. The necessity of managing millions of residents strengthened arguments for professional civil services, data collection, and long-term planning. Census taking, mapping, and statistical analysis became essential tools of governance, shaping how the state understood its population. Culturally, the city's 19th century experience left a deep imprint. Literature, journalism, and public debate reflected an ongoing effort to make sense of life in a vast metropolis. London came to represent both progress and excess, efficiency and alienation, a dual image that persisted into the 20th century. Ever wondered how London became the sprawling metropolis it is today? The story really kicks off in the 1800s. Back then, London wasn't the organized city we know. It was a dense, almost chaotic capital. But as the century unfolded, something incredible happened. Under immense pressure from a booming population, London transformed. It wasn't a single grand plan, but a gradual process of adaptation. New systems were built to manage the growth. Railways to move people, sewers to keep the city clean, and institutions to organize daily life. These systems, many of which operated out of sight, became the invisible backbone supporting millions. This 19th century foundation didn't just disappear. It's still here, quietly shaping our lives in the modern city. It's a powerful lesson in how cities evolve, balancing growth with order, and its legacy is literally beneath our feet. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden histories.